The cemetery was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind swept through the bare branches of the trees. It was a place of sorrow, where the living came to remember the dead, but for 12-year-old Brian, it was the only place that felt real. Brian stood alone at the edge of his mother's grave, his small frame hunched against the chill in the air. His mother Claire had died a year ago, taken suddenly by an illness that came out of nowhere and left Brian's world shattered. In the years since her death, Brian had been shuffled from one foster home to another, never staying long enough to feel like he belonged anywhere. Each time he unpacked his meager belongings, it was with the knowledge that he wouldn't be there for long. He had learned not to get too comfortable, not to get too close to anyone. The sense of abandonment had become his constant companion, a shadow that followed him everywhere. The cemetery was the only place where Brian felt he could still connect with his mother, where he didn't feel like a burden or an outsider. He came here whenever he could, sneaking away from the foster homes, the schools, the places where he was just another kid in the system. Here, at his mother's grave, he could be himself, just a lonely boy who missed his mom more than anything in the world. Today, the grief was too much to bear. As he stood by the grave, staring at the cold, unyielding stone that marked the final resting place of the person who had meant everything to him, the emotions he had been holding back for so long overwhelmed him. He felt his knees, his hands gripping the damp earth as if he could somehow reach her, pull her back to him. Mom, he whispered at first, his voice trembling, barely audible in the stillness of the afternoon. But the whisper soon turned into a cry, a desperate plea that echoed in the empty cemetery. Mom, please, please take me with you. I can't do this without you. I'm so alone. I need you. Please just take me with you. The tears flowed freely now, hot and bitter, as Brian sobbed uncontrollably. The weight of his loneliness, of his longing for the one person who had ever truly loved him, pressed down on him until he thought he might be crushed by it. He didn't care who saw him, didn't care if the whole world knew how much he was hurting. In that moment, all that mattered was the aching emptiness inside him, the hollow place where his mother's love used to be. He collapsed completely, lying on the ground beside the grave, his body racked with sobs. The cold earth beneath him was a poor substitute for the warmth of his mother's embrace, but it was all he had. He stayed there crying until he had no more tears left, until the grief had drained him of all energy. He lay there exhausted and broken, wishing with all his heart that he could just disappear, that the ground would open up and swallow him, taking him to wherever his mother was. But the ground remained silent, and the world kept turning indifferent to his pain. And so Brian lay there, a small lonely figure in a vast, uncaring world, with nothing but the memory of his mother to keep him company. Brian's desperate plea hung in the cold air, the words seeming to dissolve into the gray sky above him. There was no response, no sign that anyone or anything had heard him, only the stillness of the cemetery and the unyielding silence that followed his cries. The world felt impossibly vast and empty, and the loneliness that had taken root in his heart since his mother's death seemed to spread, filling every corner of his being with a cold, suffocating despair. He could feel the weight of his sorrow pressing down on him, as if the very air had turned against him, growing thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. His small frame shook with the force of his sobs, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath, but the tears kept coming, relentless and unstoppable. The pain was too much, too overwhelming, and it felt as though his heart might shatter under the strain. Brian clung to the earth beside his mother's grave as if it were the only thing keeping him anchored to this world. His fingers dug into the cold, damp soil, but they offered no comfort, no warmth. The chill seeped into his bones, but he was beyond caring. The physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emptiness inside him, the hollow space where his mother's love used to be. In that moment, Brian couldn't see a way forward. The future stretched out before him, bleak and desolate, a long, unending road of loneliness and heartache. He couldn't imagine ever feeling happy again, ever feeling safe or loved. The thought of facing another day, another year, another lifetime without his mother was unbearable. He curled up on the ground next to the grave, pulling his knees to his chest, trying to make himself as small as possible, as if he could somehow disappear into the earth, be swallowed up and taken to wherever his mother was. His sobs gradually quieted, turning into soft, broken gasps as his tears slowed. The exhaustion of his grief began to take its toll, his body growing heavy and weak. Brian's eyes fluttered closed, his tears still wet on his cheeks. The cold, hard ground beneath him was unforgiving, but in his exhaustion, it no longer mattered. All he wanted was to escape the pain, to find some relief from the constant ache in his chest. Sleep, when it finally came, was not peaceful, but it was a welcome reprieve from the crushing weight of his sorrow. As he drifted off, Brian's last conscious thought was of his mother, her face soft and warm in his memory, her arms holding him close. He wished with all his heart that he could be with her again, that he could feel her love one more time. But instead, he was left alone, a small, lonely boy in a vast, uncaring world, with only the memory of what he had lost to keep him company. And so he slept, curled up beside his mother's grave, as the cold afternoon slowly turned to night. Brian was startled awake by the sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel path nearby. His body was stiff and cold from lying on the ground, and it took a moment for him to remember where he was and why he felt so heavy with grief. As his eyes fluttered open, he saw a woman standing a few feet away, looking at him with a mix of concern and empathy. The woman was in her early 40s, with warm brown eyes and a kind, gentle face framed by soft auburn hair. She was dressed in a simple, dark coat, appropriate for the somber atmosphere of the cemetery. She hesitated for a moment, clearly not wanting to startle him, before taking a cautious step closer. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" she asked softly, her voice carrying the warmth of genuine concern. Brian quickly wiped at his eyes, embarrassed to have been caught in such a vulnerable moment. He sat up, still groggy and disoriented, and instinctively tried to pull away from the woman. His instinct was to withdraw, to hide his pain from the world, especially from strangers. "I'm fine," he mumbled, his voice hoarse from crying. He avoided her gaze, hoping she would just go away and leave him alone with his grief. But the woman didn't leave. Instead, she slowly crouched down beside him, her movements careful and non-threatening. "My name is Miss Thompson," she said gently. "I'm a social worker. I was just visiting my grandmother's grave when I saw you here. It looked like you could use someone to talk to." Brian stiffened at the mention of her being a social worker. He had encountered plenty of them in the past year, and while most had been kind, none had ever made him feel any better. They all seemed to ask the same questions, offer the same hollow reassurances, and then disappear from his life just as quickly as they had entered it. "I don't need help," Brian muttered, trying to sound tough, but his voice wavered, betraying the vulnerability he was trying so hard to hide. Miss Thompson didn't push him. Instead, she sat down on the cold ground beside him, her posture relaxed, as if she was in no hurry to leave. "I know what it's like to feel alone," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the headstone in front of them. "When my grandmother passed away, I used to come here all the time. I felt like I was the only person in the world who knew what it was like to miss someone so much." Brian didn't respond, but he didn't move away either. There was something in Miss Thompson's voice, something genuine, that made him feel, for the first time in a long while, that maybe he wasn't completely alone. Miss Thompson glanced at Brian, gauging his reaction. When he didn't pull away, she continued, her tone gentle but sincere. "I'm sorry you're going through this. It's really hard to lose someone you love, and I can't imagine how much harder it is when you don't have anyone to help you through it." Brian's defenses began to crumble at her words. He felt the lump rise in his throat, and for a moment, he thought he might start crying again. But instead, he looked down at his hands, which were trembling slightly, and whispered, it's just so hard. I miss her so much, and I don't know how to make it stop." Miss Thompson's heart ached for the boy beside her. She could see the pain etched into every line of his face, and she knew that nothing she could say would take that pain away. But she also knew that sometimes just having someone to listen could make all the difference. "I'm here," she said quietly. "You don't have to go through this alone. If you want to talk, I'll listen. And if you don't, that's okay too. But I'm not going anywhere." Brian hesitated, but then, for the first time in a long time, he began to talk. He told Miss Thompson about his mother, about the illness that had taken her so suddenly, and about how he had been bounced from one foster home to another ever since. He spoke of the loneliness that had followed him everywhere, like a shadow he couldn't escape. Miss Thompson listened without interrupting, her eyes filled with compassion. As Brian spoke, she reached out and gently placed a hand on his shoulder, a simple gesture of comfort that meant more to him than words ever could. For the first time in what felt like forever, Brian felt a tiny spark of hope flicker inside him. Maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to carry this burden alone. In the days following their first meeting at the cemetery, Miss Thompson made a quiet promise to herself. She would be there for Brian no matter what. She knew the pain of loneliness all too well and couldn't bear the thought of this boy, with such deep sorrow in his eyes, facing the world on his own. And so she began to visit him regularly, making sure to drop by this foster home at least once a week. Each visit was gentle and unintrusive. Miss Thompson never forced Brian to talk if he wasn't ready, but she always brought something with her: a book she thought he might like, a sketch pad and some pencils, or even just a small treat. At first, Brian was wary of these gifts, uncertain of her motives. But over time, he began to see them for what they were: simple, thoughtful gestures from someone who genuinely cared. As the weeks passed, Brian found himself looking forward to Miss Thompson's visits. There was something about her presence that made the world feel a little less cold, a little less empty. She had a way of making him feel seen, understood, in a way that no one else had since his mother's death. When she spoke to him, she did so with a kind of quiet patience, never rushing him, never pushing too hard. And when she listened, it was with a depth of empathy that made Brian feel like his words truly mattered. One afternoon, as they sat together in the small living room of his latest foster home, Miss Thompson shared a story from her own childhood. She told him about how she had also lost someone very dear to her when she was young, and how it had left her feeling adrift and alone. She spoke of the nights she spent crying herself to sleep, and the days she wandered through life feeling invisible. But then she talked about the moment she decided to turn her pain into something positive, how she had found strength in helping others who were struggling, and how that had slowly brought light back into her life. Brian listened intently, his heart aching with the realization that Miss Thompson truly understood what he was going through. Her story resonated with him deeply, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of something other than sorrow. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time, Ho. As they continued to talk, a bond began to form between them, one that grew stronger with each visit. Brian found himself opening up more and more, sharing not just his grief, but also the small fleeting moments of joy he remembered from before his mother's death. He told Miss Thompson about the way his mother used to sing to him at night, how they would bake cookies together on weekends, and how she always seemed to know exactly what to say to make him feel better. Miss Thompson listened with a smile, encouraging Brian to hold on to those memories, to let them be a source of comfort rather than pain. She reminded him that his mother's love was still with him, that it was something no amount of time or distance could ever take away. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Brian began to heal. The days didn't seem as dark, the nights not as long. Miss Thompson's visits became the highlight of his week, a beacon of light in his otherwise bleak world. For the first time since his mother's death, Brian felt like someone genuinely cared about him, and that feeling started to melt the icy wall of loneliness that had surrounded his heart. Miss Thompson's presence in his life became a lifeline, a source of comfort and hope that Brian clung to with all his might. He still had bad days, days when the grief seemed too heavy to bear. But now, he knew he wasn't facing them alone. He had someone who understood, someone who was there for him, and that made all the difference. The bond they were forming was unexpected, but it was exactly what Brian needed to begin finding his way back to the light. As the weeks turned into months, the bond between Brian and Miss Thompson continued to grow stronger. Miss Thompson could see that Brian was starting to trust her, to lean on her in a way he hadn't done with anyone since his mother's death. But she also knew that beneath the surface, there were still deep wounds that needed healing, fears that needed confronting. One cold Saturday morning, Miss Thompson arrived at Brian's foster home with a proposal. "How about we go out today?" she suggested with a warm smile. "I was thinking we could visit some places that your mom used to love. Maybe it'll help you remember the good times you had together." Brian hesitated. The idea of revisiting places that reminded him of his mother filled him with a mix of longing and dread. He didn't know if he was ready to face those memories, afraid they might overwhelm him with sadness. But something in Miss Thompson's gentle encouragement made him feel like it was worth a try. He nodded slowly and they set off together. Their first stop was a small, cozy cafe on the corner of Main Street, a place Brian's mother had taken him to every Sunday after church. As they walked in, the smell of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods hit Brian, bringing with it a flood of memories. He could almost hear his mother's laughter, see her smiling at him from across the table. The ache in his chest was sharp, but Miss Thompson was right there beside him, offering silent support. They sat at a corner table, and as Brian took in the familiar surroundings, he felt a small bittersweet smile tug at the corners of his lips. After the cafe, they visited a nearby park where his mother used to take him to feed the ducks. As they strolled down the familiar paths, Brian started to talk about his mother, how she would always bring stale bread from home, how she laughed when the ducks swarmed around them. For the first time in a long while, he was able to share these memories without being completely overwhelmed by grief. Miss Thompson listened with a soft smile, encouraging him to keep going. to keep remembering. Later that afternoon, Miss Thompson suggested they visit the community center where she volunteered. I want to introduce you to some kids who've been through tough times too, she said. I think it might help you to meet others who understand what you're going through. Brian felt a surge of anxiety at the thought of meeting the people. He had grown so used to keeping to himself, to guarding his heart against further pain. But Miss Thompson's presence reassured him, and after a moment of hesitation, he agreed. When they arrived at the community center, Brian was greeted by a group of kids around his age. At first, he was shy and kept to the edges of the group, unsure of how to fit in. But as the afternoon wore on, he began to notice that these kids weren't all that different from him. They too had their own stories of loss, their own struggles with loneliness and abandonment. Slowly, he started to open up, sharing bits and pieces of his own story. One of the boys, Jake, had lost his father in an accident and spoke openly about how angry it made him feel. Another girl, Maya, had been in foster care for years and understood the pain of constantly being uprooted. As Brian listened to their stories, he realized that he wasn't the only one who felt the way he did. He wasn't alone in his anger or his sadness. Miss Thompson watched from the sidelines, her heart swelling with pride as she saw Brian begin to connect with the other kids. She knew how hard this was for him, how much courage it took to open up. Later, when they were walking home, she gently broached the subject of the anger Brian had been holding on to. It's okay to be angry, Brian, she said softly. It's normal to feel that way when someone you love is taken from you. But holding onto that anger for too long can hurt you more than it helps. Brian looked down, his hands stuffed into his pockets. I just, I don't know how to let it go, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Thompson nodded, understanding the depth of his struggle. It's not easy, and it won't happen overnight. But talking about it, facing it head on like you did today, is a good start. And you don't have to do it alone. I'm here for you every step of the way. Brian felt a lump rise in his throat, a mix of emotions swirling inside him. For so long, he had felt like he was drowning in his grief and anger, unable to see a way out. But now, with Miss Thompson's help, he was beginning to see a glimmer of light in the darkness. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he had thought. As they continued their walk, Brian felt a sense of hope start to bloom within him. A small, fragile thing, but real nonetheless. He knew there would still be hard days ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he believed that he could get through them. With Miss Thompson by his side, he felt like he could face his fears, confront his grief, and begin to heal. And that made all the difference. As the months passed, the bond between Brian and Miss Thompson deepened into something neither of them had expected. What had begun as a simple act of kindness had grown into a profound connection, one that brought light back into both of their lives. Miss Thompson had seen Brian transform from a withdrawn, heartbroken boy into someone who was beginning to find hope again. And in Brian, Miss Thompson saw the kind of resilience and kindness that made her realize just how much he meant to her. One evening, after spending another day together at the community center, Miss Thompson invited Brian back to her home for dinner. It was something they had done a few times before, but tonight there was a different energy in the air. As they sat at the kitchen table, the warmth of the meal and the soft glow of the evening light created a sense of comfort that Brian had almost forgotten existed. After they had finished eating, Miss Thompson suggested they move to the living room. Brian followed her, feeling a mix of contentment and an inexplicable nervousness. There was something in Miss Thompson's eyes, a seriousness that hadn't been there before. They sat down on the couch, and Miss Thompson turned to face Brian, her expression tender yet thoughtful. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before speaking. Brian, she began, her voice gentle but steady. I've been thinking a lot about you, about us. These past few months, I've watched you grow stronger and more open, and it's been such a privilege to be a part of your life. You've become very important to me. Brian looked at her, a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. He wasn't sure where this was going, but he could feel his heart start to race. Miss Thompson reached out and took his hand in hers, giving it a reassuring squeeze. I know you've been through so much, and I know it hasn't been easy, but I want you to know that you don't have to keep moving from one place to another. You don't have to be alone anymore. Brian's breath caught in his throat as Miss Thompson continued. I want to offer you a home, Brian. A real permanent home. Not just as another foster placement, but as my son. I want you to come live with me to be a part of my family, if that's something you'd want. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Brian's mind raced, his emotions swirling in a chaotic mix of hope, fear, and disbelief. This was what he had dreamed of for so long, to be part of a real family again, to have someone who truly cared about him. But with that hope came the fear of being hurt again, of opening himself up only to be abandoned once more. He searched Miss Thompson's eyes, looking for any sign that this wasn't real, that it was just another dream that would slip away. But all he saw was warmth and sincerity, a love that was patient and unwavering. I, I don't want to lose you, Brian whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. Miss Thompson's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was steady. You won't, Brian. I promise you, I'm not going anywhere. I want you to stay with me, to be a part of my life, my family. And I'll be here for you always. Tears welled up in Brian's eyes as the weight of her words sank in. For the first time in a long time, he felt something inside him begin to heal, a wound that had been open for far too long. After what felt like an eternity, he nodded, a small, hopeful smile breaking through his tears. Yes, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I'd like that. I'd really like that. Miss Thompson pulled him into a gentle embrace, and Brian let himself be held, feeling safe and loved in a way he hadn't in so long. It was the start of a new chapter, one filled with the promise of love, stability, and the family he had always longed for. Moving in with Miss Thompson was a whirlwind of emotions for Brian. The decision to accept her offer had been a leap of faith, but now that it was a reality, he found himself grappling with a confusing mix of feelings. On one hand, he was grateful for the warmth and stability she offered, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. On the other hand, there was a nagging guilt deep inside him, an almost irrational fear that by embracing this new life, he was somehow betraying his mother's memory. The first few days in Miss Thompson's home were both comforting and unsettling. The house was cozy, filled with soft, warm light and the comforting smells of home-cooked meals. It was a stark contrast to the sterile, temporary environments of the foster homes he had known. But even as he unpacked his few belongings into a room that Miss Thompson had lovingly prepared for him, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't quite belong, that this happiness might be fleeting. Miss Thompson, perceptive as always, noticed the uncertainty in his eyes. She didn't push him to talk about it, understanding that Brian needed time to adjust. Instead, she focused on making the transition as smooth as possible, creating a stable environment where Brian could begin to feel secure. She introduced small, consistent routines, like cooking dinner together every evening, taking walks in the nearby park, and setting aside time for homework and reading. These routines gave Brian a sense of predictability and safety, something he desperately needed. Despite her efforts, Brian still struggled with the fear that this new life was too good to be true. At night, as he lay in his new bed, surrounded by unfamiliar sounds, he would think about his mother and the life they had shared. The guilt would creep in, whispering that he was forgetting her and replacing her with someone else. It was a heavy burden for a 12-year-old to carry, and it often left him feeling conflicted and anxious. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, Miss Thompson noticed that Brian seemed particularly quiet. She gently asked him what was on his mind, and after a moment of hesitation, Brian finally opened up. He told her about his fears, his guilt over moving on, and his worry that this happiness wouldn't last. Miss Thompson listened carefully, her heart aching for him. When he finished, she reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. Brian, she said softly, you're not betraying your mother by being happy. She loved you so much, and I believe she would want you to have a life filled with love and happiness. Moving forward doesn't mean you're leaving her behind. She'll always be a part of you in your heart and in your memories. Brian looked at her, tears brimming in his eyes. But what if this doesn't last? What if I lose this too? Miss Thompson smiled gently, her eyes warm with understanding. I can't promise you that life won't have its challenges, but I can promise you that I'm here for you, and I'm not going anywhere. We're in this together, okay? We're going to make this work one day at a time. Those words, simple yet heartfelt, were exactly what Brian needed to hear. As the days turned into weeks, he began to let go of some of his fears. He still had moments of doubt, but they were becoming fewer and farther between. Slowly, he allowed himself to enjoy the new life he was building with Miss Thompson, to find comfort in the routines they had established, and to trust that this happiness was real. The house, once filled with echoes of loneliness, began to come alive with the sounds of laughter, shared meals, and the warmth of a growing bond between them. Brian still missed his mother deeply, but he started to realize that accepting this new life didn't mean forgetting her. It meant honoring her memory by living a life full of love, just as she would have wanted for him. And so, the once lonely, grief stricken boy began to show glimpses of happiness and security. Miss Thompson's home became his home, not just in name, but in his heart as well. It was a journey filled with ups and downs, moments of doubt and reassurance, but with each passing day, the love and trust between them grew stronger, paving the way for a future filled with hope and healing. If you've been moved by this story and want to continue exploring more heartfelt, emotional journeys, don't miss out. Subscribe now. By subscribing, you'll stay connected with powerful stories that inspire, uplift, and touch the soul.